On a crisp autumn morning, Sophia stands outside the towering skyscraper of Carmichael Enterprises. She clutches the photograph of Edward in one hand, her other hand holding Lily's tiny fingers. For a moment, she questions her decision. Is she ready to confront the man who abandoned them? Lily looks up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, are we going to meet him today?" Sophia's resolve hardens. She needs answers. For Lily, and for herself. Inside the building, the atmosphere is electric. Edward is in the middle of a heated meeting with his board members. A potential acquisition has gone awry, and the stakes are higher than ever. His assistant, Claire, watches him from the corner of the room, her brow furrowed. She's seen this side of Edward before, cold, calculating, and utterly relentless. But beneath his steely demeanor, she senses an undercurrent of turmoil. The receptionist's voice interrupts the tension. "Mr. Carmichael, there's a woman and a child here to see you. She says it's personal." Edward waves her off without a second thought. "No interruptions," he barks. But as Claire steps out to handle the situation, she freezes when she sees Sophia. There's something about her, a mix of determination and vulnerability, that catches her off guard. Sophia insists on seeing Edward, her voice trembling but firm. "Please, I just need a few minutes." Claire hesitates but agrees to take her contact information. As Sophia and Lily leave the building, Edward remains oblivious to the storm brewing just outside his walls. Determined not to be dismissed, Sophia begins researching Edward's life. She learns about his rise to power, his philanthropic efforts, and the controversies that have followed him. But the deeper she digs, the more she uncovers about the man she once loved. She finds old interviews where Edward talks about his humble beginnings and the loss of his mother, a pain that mirrors her own struggles. Meanwhile, Lily's curiosity grows. She starts drawing pictures of what she imagines her father to be, a tall, kind man with a warm smile. Sophia's heart aches every time Lily hands her one of these drawings. She knows she has to find a way to confront Edward, but how? Claire, now intrigued by Sophia, begins her own investigation. She discovers the photograph Sophia left behind and realizes the striking resemblance between Edward and the little girl in the picture. Claire confronts Edward with the evidence, but he dismisses her concerns. "It's probably just some scam," he says, brushing her off. But Claire sees the flicker of doubt in his eyes. As the days pass, Edward's life begins to unravel. His business empire faces mounting pressure from a series of bad deals, and his carefully constructed facade starts to crack. He begins having vivid dreams of his past, memories of a simpler time when he was young and in love. One night, he wakes up in a cold sweat, his mind racing. Could the woman Claire mentioned be the same Sophia he once knew? Back in her modest apartment, Sophia faces her own challenges. Her employer at the diner cuts her hours, leaving her struggling to make ends meet. But she refuses to give up. With the help of her friend and neighbor Maria, Sophia devises a plan to get Edward's attention. Maria suggests a bold move, filing a paternity suit. At first, Sophia balks at the idea. She doesn't want to force Edward into anything. She just wants him to acknowledge Lily. But as Maria points out, it might be the only way to make him listen. The next morning, Sophia stands outside the courthouse, clutching the legal documents Maria helped her prepare. Her heart pounds as she takes the first step toward a confrontation she's been dreading for years. The news spreads like wildfire. Billionaire Edward Carmichael sued for paternity. Headlines scream. Edward is blindsided. His legal team advises him to settle quietly, but he refuses. "I need to handle this myself," he declares. The court date is set, and the city buzzes with anticipation. As Edward prepares for the hearing, he begins to question everything he thought he knew about his life. Claire urges him to consider the possibility that Sophia is telling the truth. "You owe it to yourself to find out," she says softly. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom is packed. Reporters line the back rows, their cameras clicking furiously. Edward enters, his presence commanding the room. Across the aisle, Sophia sits with Lily by her side. The sight of the little girl takes Edward's breath away. She looks just like his mother. The judge calls the court to order, and the proceedings begin. Sophia speaks first, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. She recounts their past, their brief but passionate love affair, and the night Edward disappeared without a word. Edward listens, his expression unreadable. When it's his turn to speak, Edward's voice falters. He admits to remembering Sophia, but denies any knowledge of Lily. "I didn't know," he says, his voice barely above a whisper. The courtroom falls silent as the judge orders a DNA test to resolve the matter. As they wait for the results, Edward and Sophia have their first private conversation in years. It's tense, filled with unspoken words and lingering pain. But for the first time, Edward begins to let his guard down. He tells Sophia about the pressures he faced back then, the expectations, the fear of failure, and the mistakes he made. Sophia listens, her own anger tempered by the vulnerability she sees in him. "I didn't come here to ruin your life, Edward," she says softly. "I just want our daughter to know her father." Edward looks at Lily, who's playing with a toy in the corner of the room. Something stirs in him, a feeling he hasn't felt in years. Could this little girl really be his daughter? The DNA results come back the next day, and the truth is undeniable. Edward is Lily's father. The revelation sends shockwaves through his carefully controlled world. But as the reality sinks in, Edward begins to see it not as a burden, but as an opportunity, a chance to rewrite his story and become the man he always wanted to be. Sophia took a deep breath as she stepped onto the bustling city sidewalk, with Lily holding her hand. The skyscraper of Carmichael Enterprises loomed above them like an impregnable fortress, its gleaming windows reflecting the sun's rays. The photograph in her hand was crumpled from being clutched too tightly. It was a picture from happier days, one where Edward Carmichael, now a powerful billionaire, was a far cry from the cold, distant figure she imagined he had become. She looked down at Lily, her 6-year-old daughter, whose innocent eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Are we going to see him today, Mommy?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement. Sophia's heart ached, but she nodded. "Yes, sweetie, we're going to see him." Inside the luxurious office of Carmichael Enterprises, Edward sat in his glass-walled boardroom, surrounded by executives. The discussion about a high-stakes acquisition was growing heated. Edward's piercing blue eyes darted between the charts on the screen and his advisors. "I don't care about the risks," he snapped. "We go forward with the deal." The tension in the room was palpable, but Edward thrived on control. Beneath his commanding presence, however, was a man carrying invisible scars, memories he never allowed himself to revisit. Edward's assistant, Claire, interrupted the meeting hesitantly. "Mr. Carmichael," she began, "there's a woman and a child downstairs. They insist on seeing you. The woman says it's personal." Edward barely glanced up. "Tell security to handle it," he said curtly. Claire hesitated, sensing the weight of the request but deciding not to push further. She returned downstairs where Sophia waited, her face a mix of determination and apprehension. "I'm sorry," Claire said gently, "but Mr. Carmichael isn't available. Can I take a message?" Sophia's resolve didn't falter. "Tell him my name is Sophia Bennett," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "And this is his daughter, Lily." Claire blinked, momentarily stunned, but before she could respond, Sophia turned and walked away, holding Lily's hand tightly. The next morning, Sophia was back in her modest apartment, poring over every piece of information she could find about Edward online. News articles painted him as a ruthless businessman, but there were glimpses of another side: his philanthropy, his support for orphanages, and mentions of a tragic past. A picture began to form, one that complicated her feelings. He wasn't the same Edward she had fallen for years ago, but he wasn't entirely a stranger either. Meanwhile, Lily's questions grew more frequent. "What's Daddy like?" she asked one evening as she colored a picture of a tall man with dark hair. Sophia hesitated, unsure how to answer. He's strong, she said finally, and very smart. Lily beamed. Do you think he'll like my drawing? Sophia managed a smile. I think he'll love it. Across the city, Edward found himself distracted during his evening routine. As he glanced at the photograph Claire had discreetly left on his desk, a pang of recognition struck him. The woman in the picture was unmistakably Sophia, and the little girl bore a striking resemblance to his late mother. His chest tightened, but he pushed the thought aside. It's probably nothing, he muttered to himself, yet the doubt lingered. Claire, however, couldn't let it go. She decided to dig deeper, quietly reaching out to Sophia and learning more about her story. The details she uncovered, the timeline of Sophia and Edward's past relationship, the struggles Sophia faced raising Lily alone, convinced her that this wasn't a scam. You need to talk to her, Claire urged Edward the next day. At least hear her out. Edward's frustration boiled over. I don't owe anyone anything, he snapped, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, he dreamt of his younger self, carefree, in love, and unburdened by the responsibilities that now defined his life. The dreams left him unsettled, forcing him to confront memories he had long buried. Sophia, determined not to be ignored, took drastic action. With the help of her neighbor Maria, a fiery and resourceful woman, she decided to file a paternity suit. It wasn't about money, Sophia insisted. It was about Lily knowing the truth. You've given him every chance to do the right thing, Maria said. Now it's time to make him listen. The lawsuit made headlines almost immediately. Billionaire Edward Carmichael faces paternity allegations, the tabloids screamed. Edward was livid when the news reached him. Handle it, he barked at his legal team. But when his lawyer suggested a quiet settlement, Edward refused. I'm not paying a dime until I know what's going on, he said, his voice cold. Schedule the court date. As the court date approached, Sophia found herself filled with anxiety. The media frenzy was overwhelming, and Lily's questions became harder to answer. But Maria's unwavering support kept her grounded. You're doing this for Lily, Maria reminded her. That's all that matters. Edward, too, was grappling with his own turmoil. Despite his anger, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. His conversations with Claire became more introspective. Do you ever regret the choices you've made? He asked her one evening. Claire's response was simple but pointed. Regret only means something if you do something about it. The tension in the room grew as Grace was called to the stand. Her movements were deliberate, but her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. Robert and I met 9 years ago, she started. I was waitressing at a cafe trying to make ends meet. He walked in one rainy afternoon and it felt like something out of a movie. He was charming, kind, and attentive. For months, we were inseparable. But when I told him I was pregnant, everything changed. He vanished. Robert's attorney interjected. Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay without evidence. Judge Peterson waved it off. Overruled. Continue. Ms. Scott Grace's voice grew stronger as she continued. I sent letters, left voicemails, begged for him to respond, but he never did. I was left alone to raise Ava. Every decision, every sacrifice I made for her. And now, here he is, claiming ignorance. Robert's face hardened as he listened, but there was a flicker of something else, guilt. When Grace's testimony concluded, Robert stood abruptly. Your Honor, may I respond? The judge nodded, intrigued. Proceed. Robert turned to Grace, his voice cracking. I never abandoned you. I never knew. If I had... He paused, emotion overtaking him. If I had known, I would have been there, I swear it. Grace scoffed, her anger palpable. Convenient excuse, isn't it? Do you have any idea what it's like to raise a child alone? To watch her ask for a daddy every Christmas and have no answer? The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy. Ava looked between them, her young mind trying to piece together the fractured narrative. Breaking the tension, Ava tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, "why are you so mad? I just want a daddy." The simplicity of her words struck like lightning. Grace's anger softened for a moment as she turned to her daughter, trying to explain. But before she could, Robert knelt down to Ava's level. "Ava," he said gently, his voice filled with a sincerity that silenced the entire room. "I want to be your daddy. I want to be there for you. Forever. Will you let me?" Ava's innocent reply shattered the emotional dam in the courtroom. "Will you come to my school play? Mommy always says she's too busy." Robert smiled through his tears. "I'll be in the front row." The courtroom door creaked open, and an older woman entered. She was introduced as Margaret Hayes, a former housekeeper for Robert's family during the time of his relationship with Grace. Her testimony turned the tide. "I remember Ms. Scott coming to the estate, trying to reach Robert," Margaret began. But his father's secretary intercepted every letter, every call. They said it wasn't appropriate for Robert to be tied down by a waitress. Gasps rippled through the audience. Robert's expression darkened, a storm of regret brewing in his eyes. His voice was barely a whisper when he said, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Judge Peterson called for a recess. During the break, Robert approached Grace and Ava in the hallway. His voice was raw but determined. "I can't change the past, Grace, but please, give me a chance to be there for Ava, to make things right." Grace hesitated, her heart torn. "This isn't about me, Robert. This is about her. If she wants you in her life, I won't stop it. But don't you dare break her heart." Robert nodded solemnly. "I won't." When court resumed, Judge Peterson delivered his decision. The court orders supervised visitation for Mr. Sterling to establish a relationship with Ava. Further evaluations will determine custody arrangements. Ava squealed with joy and ran to Robert, hugging him for the first time. Grace watched, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she saw not the man who had hurt her, but the father Ava had always wanted. As the hearing concluded, Robert approached Grace one last time. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me a chance." Grace nodded, her voice soft but firm. "Don't thank me. Thank Ava." They turned to see Ava twirling in the sunlight streaming through the courtroom windows, her laughter a beacon of hope. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning. The courtroom emptied, but Grace's thoughts swirled like a storm. She clutched Ava's hand tightly as they stepped outside, only to find Robert waiting near the entrance. His eyes were softer now, but Grace's guard remained firmly in place. "Grace," Robert began cautiously, "I know this has been impossible for you, but Ava deserves a chance to know me." "She deserves stability, Robert," Grace countered. Her voice was steady, but the cracks in her resolve were starting to show. Ava, sensing the tension, tugged at Grace's sleeve. "Mommy, can Daddy come for dinner?" she asked innocently. Grace froze, her instinct to protect colliding with her daughter's simple, heartfelt request. After a moment, she sighed, glancing at Robert. "One dinner. That's all." Robert nodded, relief washing over him. But neither of them noticed the reporter lurking nearby, camera ready, capturing every word. The next morning, Grace's phone buzzed incessantly. She groaned, still groggy, and reached for it. Her heart sank as she opened the news app. Splashed across the front page was a photo of her and Robert outside the courthouse, accompanied by the headline, "Billionaire heir's secret love child revealed." Panic set in. Grace immediately called Robert, her voice sharp. "What did you do? Did you tell the press?" Robert sounded genuinely stunned. "No, Grace, I'd never—" "Well, someone did. Now Ava's face is everywhere." Grace's voice cracked. fear and anger bubbling over. Robert promised to handle it, but Grace wasn't convinced. The trust they had begun to build felt as fragile as glass, ready to shatter at any moment. Later that day, Robert confronted his public relations team, demanding answers. He soon discovered the leak had come from within his own circle, an assistant eager for a payout. Furious, Robert fired the culprit on the spot and issued a statement condemning the invasion of privacy. But it wasn't enough for Grace. When Robert arrived at her apartment that evening, she met him at the door, arms crossed. "This is why I didn't want you involved," she snapped. "Your world is chaos, Robert. It's not safe for Ava." Robert held her gaze. "You're right, but running from this won't help. Let me protect both of you." Grace hesitated, torn between fear and the growing belief that Robert truly wanted to do the right thing. Just as Grace was about to respond, a loud crash came from the living room. Both turned to see a man stumbling through the window, a would-be thief startled to find the apartment occupied. Robert acted instinctively, stepping in front of Grace and Ava. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice firm. The man froze, then bolted back out the window. Ava clung to Grace, trembling. "Mommy, I'm scared." Grace held her close, her own heart racing. "It's okay, baby. You're safe now." Robert placed a reassuring hand on Ava's shoulder. "I'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again," he said, his voice steady. That night, as Ava slept, Grace sat across from Robert at the kitchen table. The fear from the break-in had shifted something in her perspective. "I don't trust easily," she admitted. "But today, you proved you care about her safety, about her happiness." Robert leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I'll do whatever it takes, Grace. I'll build a life for her, a stable one, and I want you to be part of it." Grace held up a hand. "On my terms, you're going to have to prove this isn't just a phase, that you're not going to walk away when things get hard." Robert nodded without hesitation. "I'm all in." In that moment, a fragile understanding was forged between them, one that held the promise of something stronger if nurtured. 3 months later, Grace watched Ava skip down the sidewalk, her pink backpack bouncing with each step. They were on their way to Ava's first day at a prestigious private school, one Robert had insisted on funding. Grace had hesitated at first, but seeing Ava's excitement, she knew it had been the right decision. Robert pulled up in his sleek black car, stepping out with a smile. He handed Ava a small bouquet of daisies. "For good luck," he said, crouching to her level. Ava grinned, throwing her arms around his neck. Grace couldn't help but smile. Seeing Robert's genuine effort to bond with Ava warmed her heart, even if her walls weren't fully down yet. Later that week, Robert invited Grace and Ava to dinner at his newly renovated estate. Grace had expected a lavish display, but instead she found warmth, a cozy dining room filled with photos of Ava, drawings she had made, and even a framed picture of Grace holding Ava as a baby. "I wanted this place to feel like a home," Robert explained, "not just for me, but for both of you." Ava squealed with delight at the sight of her drawings. "Mommy, look, Daddy put my art everywhere." Grace's breath caught. She looked at Robert, her eyes softening. "You're really trying, aren't you?" Robert nodded. "Every day, for both of you." As dinner wound down, Robert stood and raised his glass. "I want to say something," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "Grace, you've shown me what it means to fight for what truly matters. And Ava, you've given me a reason to be better. I know I've made mistakes, but I want to spend the rest of my life making things right." He pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple yet elegant diamond ring. "Grace Scott, will you marry me?" Grace's jaw dropped. Ava clapped her hands in excitement. "Say yes, Mommy." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "Robert, I need time to think. This is a lot." Robert nodded, his expression understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait as long as it takes." A week later, Grace sat on a park bench, watching Ava play on the swings. Miss Franklin, her elderly neighbor, joined her. "Big decisions weigh heavy, don't they?" Miss Franklin remarked, her kind eyes twinkling. Grace nodded. "I just don't know if I can trust him completely. But he's done so much for Ava. And for me." Miss Franklin smiled. "Sometimes love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up. And from what I've seen, he's been showing up for you and that little girl of yours." Grace looked out at Ava, her heart softening. Maybe Miss Franklin was right. On a sunny afternoon, Robert hosted a community picnic at his estate, a gesture of gratitude for the people who had supported Grace over the years. Families laughed and played, children ran through the gardens, and Ava introduced herself as the boss's daughter. Grace watched the scene unfold, her heart full. Robert approached her, his expression hopeful but not pushy. "Have you made a decision?" Grace turned to him, a soft smile on her lips. "I have. Let's take it one step at a time, for Ava's sake and ours." Robert grinned, his relief palpable. "That's all I've ever wanted." As the three of them stood together, the camera panned out, capturing the image of a family forged not by perfection, but by love, forgiveness, and the courage to try again. Months passed, and the tentative family began to build a rhythm together. Grace and Robert worked hard to forge a co-parenting partnership that balanced Ava's needs with their evolving dynamics. Robert kept his promises, showing up for Ava's school events, making time for family dinners, and supporting Grace's ambitions. Slowly, the walls Grace had built around her heart began to crumble. One evening, after tucking Ava into bed, Robert and Grace found themselves sitting on the front porch of Grace's modest apartment. The city lights flickered in the distance, and a comfortable silence hung between them. "You've been different lately," Grace said, breaking the quiet. Her tone was calm but curious. Robert smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Different how?" "More grounded," Grace admitted, "like you finally found what matters." Robert looked at her, his eyes earnest. "I have. And it's you and Ava. Nothing else compares." Grace's heart swelled, but she wasn't ready to fully let go of her caution. "Words are easy, Robert. Time will tell if actions match them." He nodded solemnly. "I know, Grace. And I'm here to prove it. Every single day." Robert planned a weekend getaway to a picturesque cabin by a lake, hoping to create new memories as a family. At first, Grace was hesitant, worried it might be too much too soon. But Ava's enthusiasm quickly dissolved her reservations. The trip was filled with laughter and quiet moments of connection. They spent their days kayaking, fishing, and roasting marshmallows by the fire. One evening, as Ava fell asleep on Robert's lap after a long day of playing, Grace found herself smiling at the sight. "She's so happy," Grace whispered, her voice tinged with emotion. Robert looked at her, his expression soft. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she stays that way." For the first time, Grace allowed herself to imagine a future where they could truly be a family. Not perfect, but whole. Months later, Robert once again brought up the idea of marriage, but this time, he took a different approach. Instead of a grand gesture, he invited Grace and Ava to the rooftop garden of his estate, where the three of them had spent countless evenings watching the stars. As they stood under the twinkling sky, Robert handed Grace a small, handwritten letter. "What's this?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Read it," Robert urged, his voice warm. Grace opened the letter, her eyes scanning the words that detailed Robert's gratitude, love, and hopes for their future. When she looked up, tears glistened in her eyes. "You mean every word?" "With all my heart," Robert said, taking her hands. "No pressure, no timelines. I just want you to know how much you mean to me." Ava interrupted the tender moment, tugging on Grace's arm. "Mommy, say yes. I want us to be a real family." Grace laughed through her tears, pulling Ava into a hug. She looked at Robert and said, "Yes, but only if we promise to keep taking it one step at a time. Robert nodded, his smile radiant. That's all I've ever wanted. On their wedding day, Grace and Robert exchanged vows in a small, intimate ceremony in the same garden where he had proposed. Ava stood between them, proudly holding the rings as the officiant declared them husband and wife. As they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, surrounded by family and friends, Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Their story wasn't one of perfection, but of perseverance, proof that love, when nurtured with patience and forgiveness, could overcome even the deepest wounds.